Hi, we're going to discuss genetics. We'll start off with some basics, then discuss behavioral genetics, and then in our next video, we'll talk about evolutionary psychology. Now, genetics is a tricky topic for an intro psych class because some students have never ever had genetics before, and others have had it for years, maybe even an advanced biology class. And so to bridge that gap, I'm going to start off briefly with some basics. So some of you will know a whole lot more than what I'm covering here, but for others it will be new. So a little bit about the basics, so we at least have some shared tools for then talking about how genetics is used in psychology. Okay? So first take a moment and think about yourself. Physical characteristics, personality, emotional patterns, cognitive skills, physical skills, diagnoses, whatever. Which aspects of yourself do you think are more influenced by genetics, so inherited from your parents biologically, versus environmental experience? So pause the video, take a moment, and when you're ready to begin, press play. Okay, so you probably listed a variety of characteristics, and many of them you may be thinking of as being very highly genetic or very, very much related to the environment. The reality is it's typically some sort of complicated interaction between genes and environment for most things. But even the things that we think are the most genetic, like height, for example, still have at least some environmental influence. So for example, if somebody is malnourished, they may not achieve the height that was genetically predisposed. Okay, so again, nutrition can influence height, and nutrition would be an environmental experience. Okay, so genes and environment are always interacting from that very moment that conception happens. Here's a few of the key terms. So let's start with chromosomes. Chromosomes are strands of DNA. DNA is the chemical that makes up the chromosomes. Okay, so if you look here on the slide, you'll see a diagram of DNA, and it's shaped like a double helix. That's the chemical structure. Now, some of you have studied a lot about DNA and the different nucleotides that come together. We're not going to talk about that in this class. All you need to know about the chemistry here is that DNA is the chemical that makes up the chromosomes. Okay, so chromosomes are the strands of DNA, and a typically developing human has a total of 23 pairs of chromosomes for a total of 46. But it's important to remember that they do come in pairs, and we get 1/2 of each pair from our biological mother and 1/2 of each pair from our biological father. So when I say mom or dad or refer to parents in this discussion here, I want to be very clear that I'm referring to the egg person and the sperm person, because family can mean a lot of different things. Parents can mean a lot of different things. Here I'm literally referring to the egg and the sperm people. Okay, so you get 1/2 of your genetic material from mom, 1/2 of it from dad. And because our chromosomes come in pairs, every gene also has a partner. So genes are little bits of DNA, and they are lined up on the chromosomes. Okay? They code for proteins. All right. So these little bits of DNA, we have 2 copies of each gene, one from mom, one from dad. Okay? And it is the fact that we have these 2 copies that provides the foundation for thinking about patterns of inheritance. Okay, so here's a few more terms. Phenotype and genotype. Phenotype refers to an observable trait. A genotype is the information in your genes. The way I remember the difference between those two is that genotype actually has the word gene in it. Okay? So phenotype is the observable trait, and it is influenced by genotype, but it can also be influenced by the environment. Here in this discussion, We're simply going to talk about how genotype influences phenotype. All right, another pair of terms, dominant versus recessive alleles. So an allele is a version of a gene. So if every gene has two versions, we can think about this example like there's actually multiple genes that influence eye color. I'm going to use one of those genes as an example here, and there are two choices, blue versus brown. There's another gene, it's blue versus green, and again, multiple genes, but this one gene, it's blue versus brown. Okay, so two versions, they are both alleles. Now, when you combine two copies of a gene, or two alleles, then which one is going to show up in the phenotype? Well, a dominant allele is the version of the gene that is going to win no matter what its partner is. A recessive allele is the version of the gene that only wins if its partner is also recessive. In other words, to see the dominant trait, you only need one dominant allele. It doesn't matter what the other parent gave you. But to see a recessive trait in the phenotype, you need to get a recessive allele from mom and a recessive allele from dad. And here we're talking about one gene at a time. So imagine this magnified across all the genes that we have. Okay, so for each gene, dominant and recessive. Now, for any given gene, we'll have these two copies, hidden information, so recessive information that's not showing up in the phenotype because there was a dominant allele that's sort of hiding its effects. Somebody who's carrying that information that's not showing up in the phenotype is called a carrier. We especially use that term when we're talking about carrying a recessive disease allele. So the person is healthy because they only have one copy of the recessive, but they're carrying a copy that they could pass on to their child. Okay, let's look at the way this happens. We're going to use a Punnett square. Some of you have probably done a bunch of these before. And so we're going to put the genotypes into this Punnett square. So genotypes are written in code, capital and lowercase letters. In this case, we're using big B, little b. Phenotypes are written in words. So in this case, brown versus blue. Again, we're using this specific eye color gene, brown versus blue. Brown is dominant. Dominant is represented with a capital letter. Blue is recessive, and that is represented with a lowercase letter. Okay, big B and little b. So we take two specific parents. In this case, dad happens to have the genotype for this specific gene that is big B, little b. And it just so happens that mom also has the same genotype, big B, little b. So what color eyes do you think mom and dad have? Brown, okay? They each have a copy of the dominant allele, and so the other allele, the recessive allele, isn't going to show up in the phenotype, all right? But imagine that this particular mom and dad are thinking about the possible combinations for their children. Well, that's what a Punnett square does. It allows us to make predictions about offspring, okay? So mom has some eggs that have big B and some eggs that have little b for this particular gene, because eggs and sperm only have one copy of each gene. The ones that have big B don't know anything about the ones with little b. The ones with little b don't know anything about the ones with big B. So some of her eggs have big B, some of them have little b. They don't have both. And same thing for dad's sperm. Some have big B, some have little b. When you put them together, you get a full set of chromosomes. So if mom passes on an egg with a big B and dad passes on a sperm with a big B, you would get an offspring, or a child, that has big B for this particular gene. That child, they have two dominant alleles. They would have brown eyes as the phenotype. Or maybe mom or dad passes on a big B and the other parent passes on a little b, and you get little b, big B. that's a 50% chance with this particular mom and dad. They would have brown eyes, but they would both be carriers of the recessive allele that they could pass on to the next generation. Or maybe mom passes on an egg with little b, dad passes on a sperm with little b, and then that baby gets little b, little b. Okay, so with this particular mom and dad, they have a 75% chance that their child would have brown eyes and a 25% chance of blue eyes. But of those, half of the kids actually could go on to the next generation and possibly have a blue-eyed child themselves. Okay, so Punnett squares again are about figuring out the possible combinations of babies that could come from two specific parents. Now, let's say mom had little b, that changes the possible combinations. Or let's say she was big B, again, that would change the possible combinations. Okay, but I said that eye color is actually polygenic, that means involving multiple genes. And here are the names of those genes. You do not need to know these. I just wanted to show you they actually do have names. But there's two main genes for eye color, okay? And I just want you to see how complicated this is. So polygenic, genic means genes, poly means many. In this case, polygenic with just the two genes, although some things might have many, many more than two. And if we do a Punnett square for two genes, we get 16 possible outcomes, compared to 4 possible outcomes when we were only talking about one gene. So this is it's just a geometric progression in terms of the possible outcomes for each gene that we add. Okay? So in our next video, we're going to look at behavioral genetics, and then in a third video, we will look at evolution.